What happens when a drunk Marine pushes a woman at a bar, unaware she's a Navy SEAL commander? You won't believe how her decision changed not only his life, but the entire military system. Before we continue, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your opinion inspires us to do better. The glass door with the sign, Anchor and Wave, swung open, spilling a wave of sweat, beer, and laughter into the cool night air. The sounds of the bar, music from an old jukebox, the voices of Marines, the clinking of glasses, mingled with the damp rustle of ocean fog, already creeping in from the coast. It closed behind Commander Victoria Bannister, cutting off the noise as abruptly as if someone had turned off a television, leaving her in silence beneath a flickering neon sign. Ocean fog blanketed the streets in a wet shroud, seeping into every crevice, settling on her skin like cold dew. She stood on the sidewalk, leaning against the cold brick wall of the bar, trying to remember why she had even come here tonight. The truth was simple and bitter, like the cheap whiskey they drank inside. Because no one knew her here. Because here, in this seedy bar on the outskirts of the port town of Riverside, California, 3 blocks from Camp Winston and an hour's drive from Coronado, she could be just the woman behind the counter, not the daughter of Admiral Charles Bannister, whose name was spoken with reverence in every Special Forces team from the West Coast to the East. Not an officer in the Naval Special Operations Group, not a coordinator whose decisions determined the readiness of hundreds of elite fighters, not a living icon for some, and a constant target of ridicule and doubt for others. Here she could drink water, stare into space, and not answer questions about what it was like to command people who secretly considered her unworthy of their epaulets. Victoria pushed herself away from the wall, feeling the cold brick penetrate the thin fabric of her jacket. She walked toward her car, parked across the street, under a dim streetlight that flickered with irritating irregularity. She was tall, 37 years old, with dark hair pulled back into a sensible ponytail that had long since evolved from a stylish hairstyle into a functional necessity. Gray streaks showed at the temples, which she had stopped dyeing a year ago. What was the point? Her face, where fatigue had long since replaced its youthful softness, bore the mark of those who had spent too many sleepless nights planning operations where a mistake meant death. Her green eyes, which in her youth had been called bright and lively, now bore the mark of those who had seen too many deaths, too many wounded, too many flags on coffins. On her left forearm, beneath the sleeve of her gray jacket, lay a thin, 4-inch-long scar, a reminder of that night in Kandahar province when a grenade fragment had ripped her skin down to the muscle, and she had held her position until the wounded pilot was evacuated. She remembered every second of that night. The smell of burning plastic and blood, the screams of the wounded pilot begging not to leave him, the weight of the rifle in her hands as the adrenaline began to subside and the pain became unbearable. The Bronze Star with distinction she had been awarded for that battle lay somewhere in a box at the bottom of a closet, tucked there after the awards ceremony, where she had smiled for the cameras and then gone home and cried until dawn. She hated looking at that award. Every time she saw it, she heard the pilot's screams, felt the heat of the blood on her hands. She got into her car, an old Honda Accord sedan, reliable and discreet, the kind of car you'd find in any parking lot, but didn't start the engine. Her hands were clenched tightly on the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as if she were still holding onto the helm of a boat in a storm. Her thoughts kept returning to what had happened half an hour ago, replaying the events over and over again like a worn-out tape. She sat in the far corner of the bar, at the counter where the lights were dimmer and the music louder, where she could hide from stares and questions. She didn't feel like talking. She hadn't come here to socialize. She had come here to disappear for a few hours, to blend into a crowd of strangers who didn't know her name and didn't ask questions. She ordered water, not whiskey, though the bartender, a former Navy corpsman named Tony Mackenzie, offered her favorite, a Buffalo Trace bourbon, the one she usually drank when she came here once a month. Tony recognized her not by her face, but by the way she moved. Every step was precise, economical, deliberate. Every glance assessed exits, potential threats, the placement of people in space. He'd seen enough operators in his 20 years of service, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in hundreds of bars and cafes where they gathered after missions, to recognize one when he saw one. He knew when someone needed space. He simply filled a glass with ice water, nodded, and walked away without asking questions. She respected him for that. And then they came. 4 Marines, loud, drunk, full of the kind of self-assurance that comes from youth, boredom, and the belief in one's own invulnerability. Corporal Danny Harper, 25, a huge guy with ox-like shoulders and a tattoo on his neck. The Marine Corps emblem etched in bold black lines. 6'2", 220 pounds of pure muscle, pumped up in the base gym. He'd served 7 months in Okinawa, where his crowning achievement was participating in a training exercise that was ended early by a typhoon that slammed the island. He'd never been in real combat. He'd never seen people explode. He'd never held a comrade's intestines in his hands, trying to shove them back in until the medic came running. But he knew how to talk, like he knew everything. He read a few articles, watched a few videos, listened to stories from senior sergeants, and decided that was enough to have an opinion on everything. He approached her, swaying slightly, the alcohol slowing his movements, but not his tongue. He leaned a little too close to the counter, invading her personal space with the casualness of a man who had never been punched in the face for it, and began, harmlessly at first. "You look lost, beautiful. Waiting for someone?" His voice was thick with whiskey, the words drawn out. She didn't answer. She just kept looking at her glass, at the melting ice cubes, hoping he'd get the hint. Men usually did. Usually. He didn't. Or didn't want to. His friends, Corporal Ryan Cross, a skinny guy with a nervous laugh, Private First Class Lucas Torres with a Texas accent, and another guy named Jack Weston with a square jaw and empty eyes, came closer, forming a semicircle around her. They were laughing. They enjoyed the moment when one of them was proving his dominance over a random woman at the bar. It was a game for them. A distraction. A way to while away the evening. Danny placed his hand on her shoulder, heavy, like an anchor, pressing. She felt the weight of his palm, the warmth of his skin through the fabric of her jacket, and every instinct in her body screamed at the intrusion. She slowly turned her head and looked at him. Her voice was calm, even gentle, without threat, without anger. The professional tone she used when instructing new recruits. "Take your hand away." He laughed. His breath reeked of Jack Daniels and cheap Marlboro cigarettes, sour and unpleasant. "Don't be so tense. Relax. Maybe you need company? I can keep you company. We can do anything." His friends giggled like schoolchildren, encouraging him. She repeated it, a little louder, a little colder, draining all the softness from her voice. "Take your hand away, now." It wasn't a request. It was an order. He didn't take it away. Instead, he leaned closer, so close she could see the red veins in his eyes, the dilated pupils, the bead of sweat on his forehead. "Yours are the ruin of good soldiers. You come here, demand equality, quotas, special treatment, and then men die because you're too weak to keep up. You can't drag a wounded man 100 yards. You can't run 20 miles in full gear. You don't belong here." The bar had gone silent. The music was still playing, some old country song about lost love, but the conversation had died down. People turned, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Tony, the bartender, reached for the phone hidden under the counter, preparing to call the base. 2 sailors from across the room, one in a t-shirt with the USS Arleigh Burke logo, the other in faded jeans, rose from their seats, instinctively sensing that the situation was getting out of hand. Experienced military men always knew when a fight was brewing. Victoria rose slowly, with the controlled grace of a predator. She was 3 inches shorter than Danny, and 80 pounds lighter. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen the size discrepancy and assumed she didn't stand a chance. But her movements were precise, honed to the point of automatism by years of training. Hundreds of hours on the mat, thousands of repetitions of painful holds, endless hand-to-hand combat sessions with instructors who didn't cut corners. She didn't back down. She didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on his, and there was something in that look that made him hesitate for a second. Something cold. Something dangerous. She looked him straight in the eye and said quietly, but loud enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear, "You have 5 seconds. Apologize and leave." Danny couldn't back down. Not in front of his friends, not in front of the entire bar now watching them. His pride wouldn't allow it. His ego, inflated by alcohol and years of culture that taught him a man never backs down from a woman, gave him no choice. He pushed her. Not hard. Not enough to knock her down, but enough to show her who was boss. Enough to humiliate her. Enough to put her in her place. Victoria felt her back hit the edge of the counter. The pain was sharp, familiar, but minor compared to what she'd felt before. Her body had activated the program before her mind could even issue the command. Years of training had turned the reaction into a reflex. She caught his wrist with her right hand, locked his position, spun 45 degrees, used his own momentum against him, applied a painful elbow lock. 3 seconds. Danny lay face down on the dirty floor, covered in spilled beer and sawdust, his right arm pinned behind his back. Victoria's knee was pressed into his shoulder blades, distributing his weight in a way that controlled but didn't cripple him. She could have broken his arm with one move. She could have dislocated his shoulder. She could have made sure he couldn't lift anything heavier than a pencil for the next 6 months. But she didn't. Control was more important than revenge. The bar erupted in shouts. Some were yelling, "Fight!" Some were laughing. Some were pulling out their phones to film the fight. Ryan and Lucas stepped forward, ready to intervene. But Tony jumped out from behind the bar with a baseball bat, an old Louisville slugger with a crack down the middle, and barked so loudly his voice carried over the noise. "Freeze! Nobody move!" 2 sailors stood next to him, forming a barrier. One of them, a petty officer second class named Mark Wilson, who had served on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf on a tanker protection mission, knew a move when he saw one. This wasn't a street fight. This was a technique. He spoke loudly, addressing everyone. "Patrol is on its way. Everyone stay where you are. If anyone tries to get away, I will personally make sure you are found." Victoria held Danny for another 10 seconds, letting him absorb his situation, letting the humiliation sink in. Then she released him and took 3 steps back, giving him space but maintaining a fighting stance. He jumped to his feet, his face crimson with rage and humiliation. Sweat streamed down his forehead. His eyes burned with the fury that comes when a man realizes he's been publicly humiliated by a woman. He screamed obscenities, words meant to hurt, to reduce her to something she wasn't, an object, a mistake, a being unworthy of respect. He called her names that weren't uttered in polite company, words meant to diminish, to degrade, to erase her as a person. Victoria didn't answer. Her face remained neutral, emotionless, like a mask. She calmly pulled her identification from her jacket pocket, a laminated card with her photograph, Navy SEAL, and rank information, and held it up for him to read. Commander Victoria Bannister, rank 05, Fleet Special Operations Group 1, Coronado Air Station. The silence was deafening. Danny paled as if all the blood had been drained from him. The color drained from his face, leaving it gray, almost greenish. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His friends stepped back, suddenly realizing the scale of the disaster. Ryan muttered, "Oh shit." Lucas covered his face with his hands, and Jack simply stared at the floor, as if hoping the ground would open up and swallow him. Victoria put her ID back in her pocket, and spoke in the flat, dispassionate tone she used in mission briefings when reporting casualties. "Your command will be notified by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service within the next 24 hours. You will be charged with assault on a superior officer. According to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 90, this could result in a court-martial, imprisonment, and dishonorable discharge. Your command will decide what happens next, but I will cooperate fully." A military police patrol arrived 4 minutes later, 2 uniformed sergeants, one with a clipboard, the other with handcuffs on his belt. They took statements from Tony, who recounted everything in detail, who started it, who pushed her, how she defended herself. They took statements from the sailors, who corroborated Tony's account. They took statements from Victoria herself, who laid out the facts clearly, without emotion, the way she recounted mission reports. Danny and his friends were escorted back to Camp Winston, loaded into the back of a military jeep, where they sat in somber silence, realizing their lives had just been turned upside down. Victoria stayed for another 20 minutes, finishing her water in silence while Tony cleaned up behind the bar, wiping up spilled beer, picking up broken glass. The other customers gradually returned to their conversations, though every now and then someone glanced at her, appraising, curious. Before leaving, Tony stopped her, placing his hand on the bar. He said quietly, so no one else could hear, "I served with operators in Iraq, in Fallujah in 2004. I know control when I see it. You could have broken his arm. You could have crippled him. Thank you for not doing so. This guy is an idiot, but he's a young idiot. Maybe he'll learn something." Victoria nodded without saying a word and walked out into the night. Now she sat in the car, staring at the city lights through the fog-beaded windshield. Her jaw ached from clenching her teeth. Her hands were steady on the wheel. But somewhere inside, in a part of her she never showed anyone, something was shaking. Not fear, not anger. Something else. Fatigue. The endless, all-consuming fatigue of having to prove her worth over and over again, every day, every week, every year. She had handled the situation correctly. She knew it. Controlled force, minimal damage, proper documentation, witnesses, security footage that would show he attacked first. She had done everything by the book. But Danny's words still echoed in her head, bouncing off the inner walls of her skull. "Yours ruin good soldiers." She'd heard variations of that phrase her entire career, from the very beginning, from instructors during special forces training who pushed her harder than anyone else, making her run longer, swim faster, carry more, just to see if she'd break. From teammates who doubted her every decision until she'd proven herself in combat, saved a life, completed a mission flawlessly. From senior officers who smiled in her face at meetings and then told evaluation committees she wasn't ready for leadership, that she needed more experience, more time, even though men with lesser accomplishments were promoted faster. And from her father, who never said it outright, never said it out loud, but implied it in every conversation they had about the policy of integrating women into combat units and the combat effectiveness of mixed teams. She pulled out her phone, an old iPhone with a cracked screen, the one she'd always meant to replace but never found the time to, and opened her contacts. Her father's name was there on the screen, along with a 10-year-old photo of him standing in dress uniform on the deck of an aircraft carrier. Charles Bannister, retired admiral, the architect of modern Navy Special Operations doctrine. A legend. Her finger hovered over the call button. They hadn't spoken in 4 months, since his retirement ceremony, held in a grand hall at the Norfolk Air Base with hundreds of officers, politicians, and veterans in attendance. She'd stood there in dress uniform, medals glittering on her chest, applauding along with everyone else as her father accepted awards for a career built on principles that excluded her. As speakers extolled his contributions, his wisdom, his dedication. As everyone stood and celebrated the man who, for 30 years, had insisted that women didn't belong in special forces. She didn't call. Instead, she opened her email and scrolled through the endless stream of operational updates, personnel reports, and classified briefings that defined her life. Messages from team commanders about readiness status, reports on training cycles, requests for resources for the next deployment, notifications about changes to the exercise schedule. She was responsible for coordinating the operational readiness of hundreds of operators across multiple teams. Team 5, Team 7, Team 9, each with its own needs, its own missions, its own challenges. She made decisions every day that impacted combat readiness, mission success, and lives. When a team deployed to a war zone, her decisions determined whether they would have the right equipment, the right training, the right support. She had earned every rank, every position, every ounce of respect through blood and competence. She had been through hell. She had survived. She had thrived. But tonight, in a seedy bar 3 blocks from the base, a drunken corporal who had never seen real combat had reduced her to nothing but a woman who didn't deserve to be here. Victoria closed her email and looked at the photo on her phone's lock screen, the one she'd kept there for years. Her father, in his dress uniform 30 years ago, standing on the deck of a ship, with little Victoria on his shoulders. She was 4 years old, her tiny hands clutching his cap tightly. She was smiling in that photo, a wide, childish smile, full of joy and admiration. She was 4 years old, and she thought her father was invincible, that he could do anything, that there was no problem he couldn't solve. She wondered, looking at that photo, if he ever thought the same about her. Was there a single moment when he looked at her and thought, "She did it. She proved me wrong"? She started the car, the engine purring with a familiar rumble, and drove back to the Coronado base, along empty night roads, past closed stores and the occasional streetlight. She had work in the morning. She had operators who depended on her coordination. She had a meeting at 8 o'clock regarding Team 7's next deployment to the Middle East. She had a corporal whose command would now deal with investigative service notifications and decide what to do with the soldier who assaulted a senior officer. And she had a father she still couldn't face. On Monday morning at precisely 8 a.m., the Naval Criminal Investigative Service Office at Camp Winston contacted Denny's battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Javier Martinez, a veteran of 3 deployments to Iraq and 1 to Afghanistan. A man who had seen enough disciplinary issues in his career to recognize a serious one when it arose. The report was detailed, typed across 3 pages with appendices. Assault on a senior officer of another branch of the military. Multiple witnesses, 4 civilians, 2 military personnel. Bar security footage showing the entire incident from beginning to end. The testimony of the victim, Commander Victoria Bannister, was detailed and precise. Martinez read the report twice, then called in Danny's company commander, Captain Brad Coleman, 32, a former intelligence officer turned infantryman, and his company sergeant major, Gunnery Sergeant Robert Caldwell, 45, a man with a scar on his cheek from shrapnel in Fallujah. 2 hours later, Danny stood at attention in the battalion conference room, face to face with his entire command staff, a lieutenant colonel, a captain, a sergeant, and a major, the acting legal officer who sat to the side with a laptop. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez read the charges slowly, letting each word sink in. Assault on a superior officer, Article 90 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Conduct unbecoming a member of the armed forces, Article 133. Disorderly conduct, Article 134. He explained that under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, assaulting an officer could result in a court-martial with severe consequences, up to 5 years in prison, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and loss of all veterans' benefits. The maximum sentence depended on the specific charges and aggravating factors, whether he was armed, whether it was a premeditated attack, whether serious bodily injury was inflicted. But this was career territory, where a person's life wasn't just over. It was destroyed. Danny stood there, his face pale, his hands shaking. He understood. He'd known the moment he saw her ID card at the bar. His life was over. Captain Coleman had already contacted Commander Bannister through official channels, on a secure line used for interagency coordination. He called her on Saturday morning, apologized for the inconvenience, explained the situation, and asked what course of action she recommended. She provided a written testimony, 3 pages of precise, dispassionate text describing every detail of the incident. She made it clear that she would cooperate fully with any disciplinary process the Marine Corps decided to conduct. She would appear at a court-martial if required. She would testify. She would provide all necessary documentation. But she also made a recommendation that surprised Captain Coleman. If Danny's command was willing to consider the matter through informal punishment under Article 15 rather than a court-martial, she would support a comprehensive remedial training program as part of his punishment. She explained her reasons. Danny was young. He had no prior disciplinary history. He'd made a terrible mistake, fueled by alcohol and cultural conditioning. But that didn't make him hopeless. She'd seen plenty of good soldiers whose careers were ruined by a single mistake in their youth. She didn't want to add another to the list if there was a chance of rehabilitation. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez considered this option carefully, consulting with the major, who explained the legal implications of each path. Danny was a young Marine with no previous disciplinary violations. His service record was clean. His instructors had given him positive evaluations. A court-martial would destroy him. It would be fair from a legal standpoint, But was it right for the purposes of military discipline? The informal punishment of Article 15 would be severe, but it offered a chance for rehabilitation, a chance to improve, a chance to become a better man and a better soldier. Martinez made his decision. He approved Captain Coleman's recommendation to apply Article 15, with Commander Bannister's training program as an additional requirement. Danny was informed of his rights under Article 15 by his legal counsel, a lieutenant from the Legal Aid Office, who explained each provision to him. He could refuse informal punishment and request a court-martial, which was his right under the code. A court-martial would mean a full trial with a jury of officers, the opportunity to call witnesses, and present defense evidence. But his legal counsel advised against it. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage showed he attacked first. Witnesses confirmed it. His own friends had testified, which didn't help his case. A court-martial would result in a guilty verdict and the maximum sentence. Article 15 was his best, perhaps only, chance. He agreed, signing the document with a trembling hand. The punishment was meted out by Captain Coleman in a formal ceremony, where Danny once again stood at attention while his company watched. A demotion from corporal to lance corporal, the stripe he wore with pride removed. A forfeiture of half a month's pay for 2 months, meaning he'd barely be able to pay his bills. 45 days of extra duty, working after his regular shift, cleaning barracks, restrooms, the kitchen, performing all the tasks no one else wanted to do. 45 days of base confinement, no leaving Camp Winston grounds, no going into town, no visiting friends or family. He also had to complete a 2-week intensive training program coordinated between his command and Fleet Special Operations personnel. Training began the following Monday at dawn. Commander Bannister worked with Marine Corps leadership to develop a program that leveraged existing cross-service professional development courses and invited guest instructors from across the Army. The program was designed not to punish, but to educate. Danny spent 14 days training alongside female Marines, Army soldiers, and Air Force personnel. He ran physical training under the guidance of women who outperformed him. Sergeant Carol Jenkins, 31, a veteran of 2 deployments to Afghanistan, ran 10 miles in full gear faster than he ran 8. Captain Lisa Horner of the Army, a Ranger School graduate, did more pull-ups than any man in the group. Air Force Lieutenant Megan Wright, an F-16 fighter pilot, described missions where she flew in the war zone over Syria, repelling anti-aircraft missiles and striking targets with meters of accuracy. He listened to lectures from female veterans who had earned Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. Sergeant Major Deborah Thompson, who lost a leg to an improvised explosive device in Iraq, but returned to duty and continued serving for another 10 years. Captain Emily Chen, who saved 3 wounded soldiers under fire in Kandahar, pulling them one by one from a burning car while suffering burns over 30% of her body. Major Sarah Collins, who led a platoon in the most violent area of Baghdad, lost 2 soldiers but saved the rest by making decisions that required cold calculation under the pressure of death. He read post-action reports where women saved lives and led under fire. He read about an operation in Helmand Province, where a female Marine led a platoon through a minefield, using her local knowledge to disarm 3 improvised explosive devices. He read about a hostage rescue in Yemen, where a female Special Forces operator infiltrated a building and neutralized 3 terrorists, freeing 5 hostages without firing a shot. He read statistics, studies, and analyses of the combat effectiveness of mixed-gender units that showed that, with proper training, the performance difference between men and women was minimal or non-existent. He also spent 6 hours over 2 sessions in a conference room with Commander Bannister, sitting across the table from her, listening as she explained what it meant to earn the Special Forces Trident. She told him about the training, about Hell Week, where she went 5 days without sleep, hauling boats, running along the beach, diving into the frigid ocean until her body gave out. About the dive phase where she twice nearly died from hypothermia, where she was pulled back, forced to start over, where she refused to give up even when every cell in her body screamed to stop. About ground combat training, where she learned to survive in the desert, in the jungle, in the mountains, where she learned to kill silently, efficiently, where she learned to make decisions that meant life or death. She told him about the deployment, about the night in Kandahar province when her team raided a Taliban weapons depot, about how everything went wrong when the helicopter was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, about how the pilot survived but was wounded, trapped in debris behind enemy lines, about how she held her position for 40 minutes under constant machine gun fire while the rest of the team pulled the pilot out, about how a grenade fragment tore her arm, but she kept firing because if she stopped, the pilot would die, about how she lost so much blood that she began to lose consciousness, but held on until the evac helicopter arrived. She told him about what it meant to make decisions where failure meant body bags, about a mission in Syria where she coordinated 3 teams simultaneously, where one wrong decision could lead to the deaths of dozens, about how she ordered a team to enter a building knowing it might be booby-trapped, because the hostage inside was dying and there was no time, about how the team entered, found the hostage, pulled him out alive, but one operator was wounded, about how she visited him in the hospital, looked at his bloody face and wondered if her orders were correct. She told him about the hardships of leading in an environment that questions your every move because of your gender, about how every decision she made was double and triple checked, while men with less experience were automatically trusted, about how every success she had was attributed to her father's influence, and every mistake became proof that women didn't belong in the special forces, about how she worked twice as hard to get half the credit, about how she lived with the constant pressure to be flawless, because one mistake would be used against all the women who came after her. On the last day of training, Danny had to give a presentation to his entire company. 200 Marines gathered in the battalion auditorium, seated in rows, some curious, some skeptical. He stood at the podium, his hands shaking as he held his notes, and presented what he had learned over the past 2 weeks. He spoke about the history of women in combat, beginning with the nurses of World War I who worked in field hospitals under shelling, about the Women's Army Corps in World War II, where women served as mechanics, drivers, and radio operators, freeing men for combat missions, about the female pilots who flew bombers and fighters, delivering planes to the front, risking their lives without recognition, about the nurses in Korea and Vietnam who worked in field hospitals, saving thousands of lives, sometimes under shelling. He discussed the lifting of the ban on women in combat in 2013, a historic decision that paved the way for women in all branches of the military, including infantry, armor, and special forces. He spoke of the first women to graduate from Ranger School in 2015, Captain Kristen Grist and First Lieutenant Shay Haver, who endured the same tests as men without lowering standards. He discussed the first female Marine infantry officer, Lieutenant Marina Hirt, who graduated from the infantry officer course in 2017, and the women who earned the Navy SEAL Trident, beginning in 2021, after enduring the most brutal training in the military. Then he moved on to something more personal. He talked about what he'd learned about respect, how it's not based on physical strength or gender, but on competence, character, and loyalty. He talked about how assuming someone's abilities based on appearance is lazy thinking, the result of cultural programming that has no basis in reality. He talked about how the Marine Corps' core values, honor, courage, and devotion, apply to all who earn the rank, regardless of gender, race, religion, or background. He ended by admitting his mistake publicly, without making excuses or shifting blame. He said his actions were inexcusable, the result of ignorance, arrogance, and the toxic beliefs he'd absorbed from the culture that surrounded him. He said Commander Bannister could have insisted on a court-martial and ended his career with a single recommendation, sent him to prison, erased his future. But instead, she'd chosen to educate him, to give him a chance to understand, a chance to be better. He said he didn't know if he deserved a second chance, that many would say he didn't. And they might be right, but he was grateful for it, and he would spend the rest of his time in the service proving he'd learned his lesson. He would be a voice against the very culture that led him to that night in the bar. He would defend those who were being wrongly condemned, just as Commander Bannister had defended him, giving him a chance at redemption. When he finished, the company sat in silence. No one applauded. No one jeered. They simply sat, digesting what they had heard. Some nodded, some looked at the floor, some looked at Danny with new understanding, seeing not the arrogant idiot who had assaulted an officer, but a man who had made a mistake and was now trying to make amends. Then Captain Coleman stood and dismissed them, but before they left, he spoke loudly. What you just heard is a lesson for all of us. Not just Danny, for everyone in this room. We serve together. We fight together. We die together. And gender doesn't matter when the bullets are flying. After Danny's presentation, Commander Bannister attended a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, Captain Coleman, and the battalion staff at Camp Winston, in a conference room overlooking the parade ground where the Marines were marching during morning drill. Martinez told her that Danny's presentation was good, that the Marine had truly changed, that his transformation was noticeable to everyone who had observed him over the past 2 weeks. His instructors reported that he was focused, open, and willing to learn. Command would monitor him closely going forward, tracking his progress, ensuring that the change was genuine and not just an act to soften his punishment. Martinez thanked her for her willingness to participate in the correctional process, for devoting her time and energy to educating the soldier who had assaulted her. He said that few officers would have shown such generosity of spirit, such understanding. Most would have insisted on the maximum punishment, setting an example that would show everyone that such behavior would not be tolerated. And he understood that. But what she had done required greater courage, greater vision. Victoria said she appreciated the Marine Corps' willingness to invest in rehabilitation, rather than simply ending a young soldier's career. She noted that Danny was young, only 25, that his brain was still developing, and that people that age are capable of significant change if given the right tools and motivation. She said he had made a terrible mistake, fueled by alcohol and cultural conditioning, but that didn't make him hopeless. She said the military needs leaders who can admit their mistakes and grow from them, who can confront their own biases and overcome them. She said that if Danny had learned his lesson, and she believed he had, then he could become a better leader than those who had never faced their own blind spots. As she was leaving, Gunnery Sergeant Caldwell stopped her in the hallway, his massive frame filling the doorway. He said he had served 2 combat deployments in Iraq, to Fallujah and Ramadi, where he had seen some of the most brutal fighting of the war, and 1 in Afghanistan, in Helmand Province, where the Taliban fought with fanatical determination. He said he had seen countless Marines drop out because they couldn't adapt to changing realities, because they clung to old beliefs that no longer worked in the modern military environment. He said that what she had done for Danny, giving him a chance to grow instead of destroying him, was true leadership. The kind of leadership that was missing from the military. He thanked her on behalf of everyone who understood that the future of the military depended not on maintaining the status quo, but on the ability to evolve. Victoria drove back to Coronado Base as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. She turned on the radio, an old country song playing softly, and for a few minutes allowed herself to simply be, not think about work, about responsibility, about the burden she carried each day. Her phone vibrated with a message from her deputy, Commander Jason Wilcox, asking if she had reviewed the new training schedule for Team 7's next quarter deployment to the Middle East. She replied curtly that she would look into it tomorrow morning, and that she was taking the evening off. This was rare for her. She usually worked late into the night, reviewing documents, answering emails, coordinating operations. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot at Torrey Pines Beach, one of her favorite spots, where the ocean met the high cliffs, where she could sit and watch the sunset and listen to the waves. She got into the car, opened the windows, letting in the fresh ocean air, and pulled out her phone. Her father's contact was still there, still unanswered since last Friday. She opened a new message and typed slowly, considering each word. "Dad, I dealt with something this week that you would have handled differently. A soldier attacked me at a bar. I could have ruined his career, but instead, I helped him study. I'm not sure it was the right decision from a discipline standpoint, but it felt right from a human standpoint. I'd like to talk about it if you have time. I miss our conversations. I miss you." She stared at the message for 5 minutes, her finger hovering over the send button. The fear of rejection, the fear that he wouldn't respond, or that he would respond coldly, critically, was strong. But stronger was the need to reconnect with him, the connection that had once been so important to her. She pressed send and placed the phone on the seat next to him, not expecting a quick response. 3 minutes later, her phone rang. Her father's name appeared on the screen, along with a photo. Her heart began to pound. She answered, her voice hesitant. "Hi, Dad." The voice on the other end was weaker than she remembered, the effects of the stroke making his speech slower but still recognizable. "Victoria, I'm glad you called. Or rather, texted. I heard about what happened." The conversation lasted 40 minutes, the longest they'd had in 2 years. Her father said he'd heard about the incident online long before she reported it. Everyone in Navy Special Operations knew everyone else, and rumors spread like wildfire among flag officers, especially when it came to something involving one of the first female operators. He said several colleagues, Admiral Thomas Radford, Admiral Sarah Kingston, Captain Michael Dorset, had contacted him asking if he knew details about how his daughter was coping. He said he initially felt anger, a desire to find the corporal and personally ensure he never wore uniform again. But then, he learned the details. About how she handled the situation with control, minimal force, and professionalism. About how she recommended rehabilitation instead of termination. About the training program she developed and implemented. And he realized she had done the right thing, not the way he would have done 20 years ago, but the right thing for today. For the type of leadership the modern military requires. He told her he was proud of her for her decision, that it had required more courage than simply crushing a soldier through the disciplinary system. Then he said something that made her freeze, something that broke through the defenses she had built around herself over the years. He spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. "Victoria, I want to tell you something I should have told you years ago. I was wrong about integration." She didn't answer right away, unsure what to say. He continued, "Not entirely, not on every tactical consideration. I still have concerns about some aspects of implementation, about physical standards, about the long-term impact on unit cohesion. But I was wrong about the fundamental assumption on which my entire career was built. I thought women couldn't perform at the level teams demanded. I thought biological differences created an insurmountable barrier. I was wrong." He said that watching her career over the past decade had forced him to reconsider assumptions he'd held for 40 years, ever since he himself had undergone frogman training in the 1970s. He said it hadn't been easy, that admitting you were wrong about something that had shaped your life was painful. He said he'd watched her go through training, how she handled deployments, how she made decisions in her current role, and each time, his confidence in his old beliefs had weakened. He said he still has concerns about the long-term consequences, that integration is a process that will take generations, that there will be problems that cannot be foreseen. But he can no longer claim that women don't belong in the special forces, because she and other women like her have proven otherwise through their actions, their achievements, their service. He said he was proud of her, not just for what she had accomplished, though her accomplishments were impressive by any measure, but for the way she led, for how she turned a moment of violence into an opportunity for growth, not just for the soldier who attacked her, but for the entire system, for how she demonstrated that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to rebuild, for how she honored the Trident by making the community better, more inclusive, more just. Victoria sat in the car, tears streaming down her face, smearing the mascara she rarely wore. Her throat tightened, making it difficult to speak. She whispered through her tears, "Thank you, Dad. You have no idea how much this means to me." "I've waited my whole life to hear those words," he replied, his voice also thick with emotion. "I know, and I'm sorry it took so long. I was a stubborn old man, too proud to admit that the world had changed, that I had to change with it. But you, your sister Elizabeth, taught me. Your lives were a lesson I finally learned." They talked for another 20 minutes about small things, his health, her work, her family. They agreed to talk again the following week. Not just a quick call, but a real conversation. Maybe a video call so they could see each other. They agreed that she would come visit him next month, spend the weekend in Virginia, at the family home overlooking the bay. They agreed to begin rebuilding what had been destroyed for too long. Not quickly, but gradually, with patience and honesty. When the call ended, Victoria sat in silence for another 10 minutes, watching the last light fade over the ocean, the stars beginning to appear in the dark sky. The waves crashed on the shore below, their rhythmic sound soothing. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not complete, not absolute, but the beginning of peace. The first glimmer of what could be if she allowed herself to let go of anger, resentment, the need to prove herself. She started the car and drove home to her apartment in Coronado, a small place overlooking the bay where she kept a minimum of belongings because she spent most of her time at work. But tonight she planned to cook dinner. Not reheated food, but a real dinner. Maybe pasta, maybe a salad. She planned to open a bottle of wine she'd bought a year ago, but never found an excuse to open. She planned to watch something light on TV, not the news, not a war documentary, but something funny, something that would make her forget about work for a few hours. She planned to allow herself to be human, not just an officer, not just a cameraman, but a human with weaknesses, desires, needs. 3 months later, on a cold January morning, Lance Corporal Danny Harper reported to his company sergeant major, Gunnery Sergeant Caldwell, in his office at Camp Winston. He held a folder of documents. His uniform was impeccably pressed, his boots gleaming. Caldwell, seated behind a desk covered with reports and exercise maps, looked at him appraisingly. Danny asked permission to speak. Caldwell nodded. Danny said he wanted to renew his contract for another 4 years and apply to Marine Officer Candidate School. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, crossing his massive arms over his chest, and asked bluntly, "Why? 3 months ago you were a hair's breadth away from a court-martial. You lost rank. You lost respect. Now you want to become an officer? Explain to me why I should support that request." Danny answered, not breaking eye contact. "Because I want to lead, Sergeant. Not in the way I used to think, where leadership is about dominance, control, and force. I've learned that leadership is about making people better. It's about seeing potential in those others reject. It's about giving second chances to those who deserve them. Commander Bannister taught me a lesson I'll never forget. She could have destroyed me, but instead, she built me up. I want to do the same for others. I want to be the kind of leader she is." Caldwell looked at him for a long moment, assessing his sincerity, searching for signs of manipulation or simply words spoken to gain approval. He found nothing but honesty. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a recommendation form, and began filling it out. He said without looking up, "I'll support your request, Harper, but know this. Officer Candidate School is one of the most difficult experiences you'll ever endure. They'll break you physically, mentally, emotionally. They'll look for any reason to kick you out, and with your past, they'll look at you especially closely." Danny nodded. "I know, Sergeant. I'm ready." Caldwell signed the form and handed it to Danny. "Then don't let me regret this decision." At Naval Air Station Coronado, Commander Bannister continued her work coordinating Special Forces team readiness and training cycles. Her inbox remained full, with over 100 messages daily. Her days remained long, often starting at 6 a.m. and ending at 9 p.m. Her calendar was filled with meetings, briefings, and coordination calls with team commanders, logistics officers, and intelligence analysts. She was responsible for ensuring that each deploying team had the right equipment, the right training, and the right information to carry out their missions safely and effectively. But something had changed inside her. The burden she'd carried, the need to prove herself every day, to justify her existence in a community that had questioned her from the start, had eased. It hadn't disappeared. She still faced doubt, ridicule, comments from those who would never accept her. But now she had something she'd never had before. She had the approval of her father, the man whose opinion mattered more than anyone else. She had the knowledge that she'd changed at least one life for the better, that Danny was a better soldier, a better man, thanks to her decision to teach rather than punish. She had a sense of purpose that went deeper than simply completing tasks. She visited her father twice a month now, flying to Virginia on Friday evenings, spending the weekend at the family home, and returning on Sunday evenings. They didn't dwell on the past or dredge up old wounds. Instead, they talked about the future, about how to better integrate women into special operations, how to overcome remaining barriers, how to change the culture without sacrificing standards. Her father began writing again, using one hand. The other was still partially paralyzed from a stroke, typing slowly on the laptop Victoria had bought him. He wrote, not doctrines, not manuals, but reflections on leadership and change, on how organizations adapt, on the mistakes he had made in his career, the lessons he had learned too late. He asked Victoria to review his drafts, suggest edits, add her perspective. She did so with relish, spending evenings reading his words, scribbling notes in the margins, offering revisions based on her own experiences, which were different but complementary. One evening, sitting on the veranda of his Virginia home overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, the sunset turning the water gold, her father said something to her that she would remember forever. He said it looking out at the bay, not at her. "Victoria, I underestimated your resilience. When you said you wanted to try out for special forces, I thought it was a phase, that you'd quickly find it too hard, too demanding. I thought the teams would break you, that the physical demands, the mental pressure, the cultural hostility would wear you down until you quit. I was wrong. You not only survived, you thrived. You became better than many of the men I served with." Victoria felt tears welling up, but held them back. She spoke softly. "There were nights when I almost quit, Dad. Nights when I sat in my room and thought it wasn't worth it, that the pain, the humiliation, the constant struggle was too much. But I stayed because operators don't give up. You taught me that." Her father turned to her, his eyes moist. "No, you taught yourself that. I gave you the tools, but you built a life. You honored the trident better than most who bear it, including me." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the cries of seagulls, the crash of waves, the distant sound of a boat engine. The legacy that had once seemed like a burden, weighing on her shoulders every minute, now felt like a foundation upon which she could build. The work wasn't finished. There were still barriers to overcome, prejudices to dismantle, hearts and minds to change. But for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged in this world, that her place here was deserved, undeniable. 3 years later, on a hot August day, Victoria stood at a promotion ceremony in a large conference room at Coronado Air Force Base, where hundreds had gathered. She was being promoted to Captain, 06, making her one of the highest-ranking female officers in Naval Special Operations, one of the few women in history to achieve this rank. It was a monumental achievement, the result of 20 years of service, countless sacrifices, decisions that cost her sleep, relationships, and pieces of her soul. Senior officers from across the West Coast attended the ceremony. Admiral Thomas Radford, commander of Naval Forces West Coast. Admiral Sarah Kingston, the first female admiral in Fleet Special Operations. And Captain Michael Dorset, a legend among operators. The operators she served with filled the front rows, men and women who trusted her with their lives, who knew her value. Colleagues from other branches of the military came to honor her. Officers from the Army, Marine Corps, and Air Force. Several journalists sat in the back, taking notes for articles about women in combat roles, about progress, about the future. Her father sat in the front row, in a wheelchair, his body weakened by his second stroke the year before. His right side was partially paralyzed, his speech slow, but his mind remained sharp. He was dressed in his dress uniform, though technically he was no longer allowed to wear it. But no one would dare tell him that. Next to him sat Victoria's sister, Elizabeth, 34, a doctor in Boston, who had taken the day off work to be here. When Admiral Redford, a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence, pinned the new captain's insignia to her uniform, the room erupted in applause. The operators stood clapping and whistling. Her father slowly raised his right hand, the one that still worked, in salute. Victoria returned the salute, her hand steady, her eyes meeting his, and in that gaze, years passed, disagreements, reconciliations. For the first time in 20 years, she felt she had proven, not to the world, not to the military, but to herself, that she belonged where she belonged, that she had earned every inch of it. After the ceremony, a reception was held in the Officers' Club, a large room with panoramic windows overlooking the bay where yachts bobbed on the waves. Tables were covered with white tablecloths, and platters of appetizers and drinks were laid out. People gathered in groups, talking and laughing. Operators shook her hand, hugged her, a rarity in this culture, and congratulated her. They shared stories of the missions she coordinated, the training she improved, the decisions that saved lives, though she would never know all the details because many operations remained classified. A young lieutenant, James Rodriguez, 26, fresh out of Special Forces training 3 months earlier, approached her timidly, holding a glass of water with trembling hands. He asked permission to ask a question. She nodded, smiling. He asked, stuttering slightly. "Captain, how did you deal with everyone doubting you? I mean, I've read about your career, everything you've been through. How did you not give up when everyone said you couldn't?" Victoria looked at him, seeing in his eyes the same doubts, the same fears she had felt 20 years ago. She smiled, the first real, warm smile she had seen all day. "Lieutenant, I failed. It's true. I cried. I was angry. There were times when I wanted to give up, to leave, to find an easier way. But I didn't give up, because I understood that this was more than just about me. Every time I went through a test, I opened the door for those who would come after me. Doubt is a part of every operator's life, not just women. Everyone who wears the trident has doubted themselves at least once. But you don't let doubt control you. You do the work. You prove your worth every day through your actions, not words. And over time, the doubts become less. Not completely gone, but less. And that's all it takes to keep moving forward." The lieutenant thanked her, his eyes shining with determination, and walked away. Victoria glanced across the room at her father, who was talking to Admiral Radford, laughing about something. Her father looked happy, relaxed, no longer burdened by the weight of command he'd carried all his life. The weight of responsibility for lives, for doctrines, for reputations. She approached him, placing her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her with pride that was genuine, without a shadow of a doubt. "I wish your mother could see this," he said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. Her mother, Catherine Bannister, had died 10 years ago of lung cancer, though she had never smoked. Victoria remembered her as a woman of strength, gentleness, and wisdom, who always believed in her, even when her father doubted her. "She would know why she should be proud," Victoria replied quietly. She always knew. Her father nodded, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. "She always believed in you. She told me you'd do great things, that you'd change the world. I didn't listen. I was too stubborn, too sure of my convictions. But she was right. She was always right." They sat together, father and daughter, against the backdrop of the sounds of the reception. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, music playing softly. The world outside continued to spin. Conflicts continued. New operators were trained. New missions were planned. New enemies emerged. But in this moment, in this room, Victoria allowed herself for a moment to simply be. Not an officer, not the daughter of a legend, not a symbol of progress, but simply a woman who had achieved something significant and earned the right to celebrate. A week later, Victoria received a letter in the mail, an old-fashioned envelope with a return address from Georgia, written in neat handwriting. She opened it carefully, sitting at her desk in the office between meetings. Inside was a single page, written in a hand that seemed familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. "Dear Captain Bannister," the letter began. "I'm not sure if you remember me. 3 years ago, I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life in a bar on the outskirts of Riverside. I was a drunk, arrogant idiot who thought he knew everything about the world, even though he knew nothing. You could have destroyed my career with one word, sent me to jail, erased my future. But you gave me a chance. You taught me to see the world differently, to respect people for their actions, not their gender or appearance. I wanted you to know that next month I graduate from officer candidate school. I will be a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the instructors pushed me, when my body gave out, when my mind told me to stop. But I remembered the lesson you taught me. Real power is not dominance. It is control. It is mercy. It's the ability to build, not tear down. I'll never forget that lesson. Respect isn't given. It's earned. I'll spend the rest of my career trying to be the leader you saw in me when others saw only a failure. Thank you for the second chance. Thank you for believing in me. With deepest respect, Second Lieutenant Danny Harper, United States Marine Corps. Victoria folded the letter slowly, her hands shaking slightly. She placed it in a drawer, in a folder where she kept other letters she'd collected over the years. From operators she'd trained, from colleagues who'd become friends, from the families of soldiers she'd helped save, from people whose lives she'd touched in ways she'd never even imagined. This was her true reward. Not medals, not ranks, but the knowledge that she'd changed lives for the better. She opened her laptop and began working on the next operational directive, the deployment plan for Team 9 to the Middle East, where the situation was becoming increasingly volatile. There was still much to be done. Operators depended on her decisions. Missions depended on her coordination. Lives depended on her competence. She couldn't afford to relax, rest on her laurels, or celebrate for too long. The work continued. That evening, as she was driving home along the empty roads of the base, her phone rang. It was her father. "Have you seen the news?" he asked, his voice as excited as possible given his limitations. "What's the news, Dad?" she replied, putting the phone on speakerphone. "Congress has approved a new funding program to increase the recruitment of women into special operations by 50% over the next 5 years. They're using your training program, the one you designed for that corporal, as a national model for training all units. The Department of Defense has issued a directive recommending that all branches of the armed forces implement similar programs. Victoria, you haven't just changed one life, you've changed an entire system." Victoria stopped on the side of the road, digesting the information. Her program, which she developed in a few days 3 years ago for the one soldier who'd attacked her, was now becoming a national standard, a model for training millions of troops. She didn't know what to say. The words caught in her throat. She simply sat, holding the phone, listening to her father's voice as he continued to go on and on about the details. How her name had been mentioned in a congressional report. How senior officers had praised her approach. "Victoria?" her father called when she didn't answer. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered. "I just didn't expect this. I thought it was just one situation, one soldier." "No," he said firmly. "This was the beginning. You showed that there was another way, a better way. You proved that education is more effective than punishment, that rehabilitation creates better leaders than destruction. The military changes slowly, but when it changes completely. And you were the catalyst for that change." They talked for a few more minutes, her father sharing details he'd learned from his old contacts, from the admirals who still called him for advice. Before hanging up, he added, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm proud of you, Victoria. Every day, every minute. You've become the leader I never was. You've changed the world for the better, and that's the greatest achievement any military man can achieve." She thanked him, and the call ended. She sat in her car on the side of the road, the headlights illuminating the empty highway ahead. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of pain, disappointment, or anger. They were tears of relief, recognition, a deep satisfaction from the knowledge that her life had mattered, that her struggle hadn't been in vain, that every blow, every humiliation, every sleepless night had led to something greater than herself. She wiped her face with her sleeve, took a deep breath of the salty ocean air that drifted through the open window, and drove on. The road ahead was long, but she now knew she wasn't alone. There were other women following her, young lieutenants just beginning their careers, girls in high school dreaming of service, future generations who wouldn't face the same barriers because she had broken down some of them. Years later, when Victoria was asked to speak at a graduation ceremony for new Special Forces operators at the Coronado Air Force Base, she stood before an audience of 300 young men and women who had just earned their trident, endured the most brutal training in the military, and proven their right to wear the symbol of the elite. Among them were 30 women, more than ever before in a single graduating class, the result of new recruitment and training programs that were based in part on her work. She spoke for 30 minutes, standing at the podium without notes, her voice firm, clear, and filled with conviction. She spoke of what it means to be a camera operator, of sacrifice, of pain, of triumph, of moments of horror and moments of heroism, of comrades she lost, of missions that forever changed her. But most of all, she spoke of legacy. Legacy isn't just what you inherit from those who came before you, she said, her voice echoing throughout the room. It's what you leave behind for those who come after. Each of you here has a responsibility not only to your team, not only to your country, but to future generations of operators. You will set the tone. You will create the culture. You will decide whether this community will be based on respect and competence or prejudice and fear. The choice is yours, and it matters. She looked at the faces before her, young, determined, not yet touched by the reality of war, not yet bearing the scars it bore. I know some of you will face doubts. People will question your right to be here. They will say you're not strong enough, not fast enough, not good enough. They will judge you not by your actions, but by your looks, your gender, your background. Don't listen to them. Listen to the voice inside you that says you've earned this place. Because you have. Each of you has been through the same hell, the same trials. Each of you has proven your worth, and no one can take that away from you. Applause thundered through the hall, a wave of sound that rose and fell. The cameramen stood clapping, whistling, shouting. As she stepped down from the podium, a young lieutenant, Emily Zhang, 24, approached her. Her eyes glistened with tears. She said, her voice trembling, "Captain Bannister, I just wanted to say thank you. You paved the way for people like me. Without you, I wouldn't be here. I'll never forget that." Victoria placed her hand on the girl's shoulder, feeling the slender muscles, the result of months of grueling training. "No, Lieutenant. We blazed a trail together. All the women who served before me, who fought when they weren't allowed to fight, who proved their worth when they weren't given the chance. I simply continued the work they started, and now it's your turn to do the same for those who come after you. That's the legacy. That's what it means to be an operator." The lieutenant nodded, her face full of determination and pride. Victoria watched her leave, joining her comrades, laughing, hugging, celebrating. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt her work here was done. Not because the fight was over. Fighting never ends. There are always new barriers, new prejudices, new battles. But because now there were others ready to continue it. Strong, trained, determined. She stepped out of the building into a warm California evening. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The ocean was visible in the distance, its waves gently rolling onto the shore, inexorable and eternal, continuing their movement regardless of human drama. She thought of all the people who had brought her here, her father who taught her perseverance even when he doubted her path, who gave her tools even when he disagreed with her goals, who eventually admitted his mistake and gave her the acceptance she had sought her entire life. Her mother who believed in her unconditionally, who died before seeing all her accomplishments, but whose voice still echoed in her head during difficult moments. About Tony, the bartender from Anchor and Wave who recognized the cameraman when he saw her, who protected her when the situation spiraled out of control. About Danny, who turned his worst mistake into an opportunity to become better, who became a symbol of how people can change, grow, and overcome their prejudices. About the countless operators, men and women, who fought alongside her, trusted her, and helped her become the leader she is today. Legacy, she thought, looking at the setting sun, isn't a weight you carry on your shoulders, crushing and suffocating. It's a light you pass on to the next generation, a torch that lights the way. And as long as the new generation held that light, the torch burned brightly. The future was in safe hands. She got into the car, started the engine, and drove home along familiar roads, past the base buildings, past the training grounds where new candidates would begin their journey tomorrow, past the ocean that had seen thousands of operators before her and would see thousands after her. She was ready for what tomorrow would bring, whatever challenges lay ahead, because she was an operator. She was a leader. She was a woman who changed the world, and her story was far from over.